Val.
Right. I'm grateful for the welcome to these lands. I'm grateful to my colleagues and to all of you for taking the time to share with us tonight, to share our work, as well as this opportunity to celebrate, which is just so superb. Happy International Women's Day. So this talk is an experimental fusion of Cree and Gitxsan beliefs and understandings, past, present, and future. It's also an exploration of individual and collective legal agency, both before and after death, and about how our cosmologies fundamentally shape how we see, create, define, and practice law. I'm going to tell you this story now. It's called Cosmology and Law in a Spirit Respite Village. Pain, grief, and fear, and then darkness born of violence engulfed Veera. She slowly descended into a sense of nothingness, of emptiness, but all the while, she still was. She existed, and in the far distance, a slight glow. Was that a path? What happened? Where was she? She felt a longed-for peace, a silence, and around her, she felt faint stirrings, presences. She turned toward the light, moving in its direction, and beside her appeared a striking old woman with her long white hair tied back. She wore a red tracksuit and, a little surprisingly to Veera, hiking boots. Veera recognizes the old woman as Eva, a relative from long ago. As the light turned to day, she followed Eva along a path into a large mountain village. And in the valley and along the mountainsides, Veera saw fantastical dwellings of every kind. And this village was filled with women and girls going about their day. Indigenous women and girls. Thousands. Through a confusion of great sadness and profound happiness, Veera came to realize that she was in the village of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Wait, wasn't that Irene from long ago? And Pamela, lost last year? And there was Elsie, too. Eva explained to a barely comprehending Veera that this village was a safe place for the souls of women and girls to rest while they decided whether to return to Earth as reincarnated beings or whether to stay in the universes beyond. While here and while deciding, they could visit their former worlds as owls, inhabiting owl forms while observing, thinking, and deciding. Suddenly, Veera is deeply weary, needing to retreat from Eva and everyone else. She had to think, she had to watch, figure it out. Her last years had included so much crushing pain and numbness. She stopped believing that she mattered long ago. The points of light and love and hope in her life had grown farther apart and were shorter lived, fleeting. It seemed that what she had lost was her very humanity, causing her to become invisible as a human being to others, mainly men. How did this happen? Veera wants to mourn her losses and the losses of so many others. As Veera sits quietly in the village square with her eyes closed, she becomes aware of presences gathering. She opens her eyes to a circle of women, some old, others achingly young. Veera looks from face to face and then asks, "How did this place come to be? Why?" "I am Debbie," said a very thin young woman sitting to her left, an adolescent really. She said, "We created this place about 40 years ago, maybe longer now. There were so many of us being killed, so much violence in our deaths, like yours." She reached out to touch Veera's face gently. She continued, "We needed a sanctuary, a justice shelter. We still do. This is an international community, and the spirits of women and girls stay as long as they like. Some of us have been here from the beginning. Others go back and are reborn, usually more than once." "But why just women and girls?" said Veera. An older woman begins to talk. "The violence comes from many places. Sometimes our families and our communities are not safe. For others of us, the violence comes from outside our communities, so we have violence from strangers too. And of course, many of our people live in cities now for different reasons. We are students, daughters, workers, grandmothers, sisters, aunties, and mothers. We are everyone." Another woman, young and smart-looking, said, "We know Indigenous men and boys face much of the same oppressive colonial violence as we did, and those experiences must be taken seriously and dealt with on their own terms. As Indigenous women and girls, we also faced additional, often violent sexual oppressions because of our gender." Eva said, "Some of us are heterosexual or lesbian or transgendered. In fact, we are the whole LGBTQ garden. And we were not perfect in our lives, any more than we're perfect now. But we are human and deserving of dignity, no matter how imperfect we are. That means that we are also legal agents then and now. We were never just victims. We were citizens, and we matter." She moved to sit beside Veera and took her hands and said, "You matter, Veera. Throughout your life you made mistakes, but you made decisions as you were able in the very life you had. And sometimes you messed up, but you still matter, and you are and always have been a citizen and a legal agent according to Cree law." "Why are you telling me this?" Veera asked. And Eva spoke kindly, "Because it changes how we think of ourselves and each other. In Canada, we're called the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, but we're missing from all over Great Turtle Island and from South America and Australia too. We are missing and murdered from the world. What if all of the folks in Canada and in the other countries understood us both as legal agents as well as the missing and murdered? And what if they were able to see the conditions of violence that led to us being here now? There's an inquiry going on in Canada. I hope they can learn to see us as legal agents and to see the conditions of violence too." Debbie spoke up. "What is new in this century is the level and extent and the relentlessness of the violence done to us. I was a law student, and my professor, John Burroughs, said there was never a time when Indigenous people did not need law. The thing is, our societies were lawful precisely because we have always had to deal with human violence and vulnerabilities. Today, the problem is that while our laws have not gone anywhere, they've been undermined. There are gaps and there are distortions. Where there are gaps in our laws and where Canadian law has failed, these are spaces of lawlessness, and violence happens in these spaces. Mary, who had been quiet and watchful, said, "We're free here. We can be anybody and everybody. You can be imperfect, sassy, angry, smart, sexy, troubling, and kick-ass. Nobody is holding us up as sacred skirt-wearing women or as idealized mothers of various nationalisms. It's the idealizations that create stereotypes of us. And then what happens when we don't live up to them? I think our so-called failures to live up to those abstract stereotypes are just another excuse for the violence against us." Eva chimed in. "We are creating new narratives, new stories, and those of us that go back will take them with us. We are using the architecture of the oral histories from our own societies, like the adaptive management stories. Veera, do you remember the stories you were taught? Not everyone had that benefit, but those stories are tools for thinking, one of the forms of legal precedent for the practice of our laws, and we need them for the rebuilding of our laws and our lawful communities today." Veera listened carefully. Is there hope? Can we create lawful communities that are safe? Can we really reconcile, like the TRC said? Gertie, with wild gray hair, was standing on the outside of the circle. She snorted. "There's always hope, Veera. Pessimism is the worst form of arrogance. But there must be standards for what reconciliation means. How will reconciling be meaningful? How will reconciliation change the relations of power?" Sheila, who had been listening carefully, spoke up. "It's really important that we're completely pragmatic about spirituality and about the sacred. Otherwise, to quote the Dalai Lama, both spirituality and the sacred become red herrings, detracting from the hard economic, political, and legal issues before us. And when that happens, spirituality and the sacred can become cop-outs." Jeanette, a large, smiley woman, spoke up. "A society's legal order and law is founded on each society's cosmology. Spirituality cannot help but be a part of every legal system. It must inform the rebuilding of Indigenous law as well as any meaningful reconciliation process. But it cannot stop the critical nature of law or the reasoning, problem-solving processes, and it cannot be used to hide power imbalances." Hilda added, "Reconciliation must include and struggle with the conditions of sexual gendered violence, including our deaths. This means that neither Indigenous spirituality nor Indigenous law can be fundamentalists, but must be open to challenge and to change." Veera was shaking her head. "Why do you keep bringing this back to law? Does everything have to be about law?" Laughing, Jennifer said, "Most things are about law. Spirituality, humanity, collective life. We engage with law to be our best selves. Our understanding of ourselves and law are both born of our spirituality." Listen to this quote. "Law, in this conception, is most meaningfully operative when it functions in a context in which individual consciousness has striven to understand the reason and purpose for that law, and is motivated to follow that law as part of the process of individual spiritual growth and fulfillment." Woo woo, don't you sound smart now, giggled Gina. Is that Cree philosophy? Well, it could be, answered Jennifer, since it reflects Cree's spiritual notions of agency, intellectual responsibility, and law, but it's actually Baha'i. Well, I'll be, smiled Gina. As the laughter subsided, Veera asked the circle, have you seen my mum? She must be an owl now, or she's gone back to the world. Mary answered, she's on the coast now, and she's fighting for safe, lawful communities. And she's helping to build a first ever Indigenous law degree program. You should be proud. Veera spoke softly. There are so many questions. I'm going to spend some time as an owl and think and watch. Do you know that there are owls of every size all over the world? And I can do some traveling. And that's the story of cosmology and law in a spirit respite village. And so there's lots of questions. Here are a couple of themes to add to our discussion tonight. Indigenous law as law. Spirituality or not, Indigenous law has to do the unflinching hard work of law, including enabling people to deal with complex problems such as gendered sexual violence. It's so easy and seductive to focus on the beauty and the strengths of Indigenous peoples and on Indigenous spirituality, and in doing so, skip over the uncomfortable conversations about power, about gender, sexuality, authority, and legitimacy. The rebuilding of Indigenous law must be community-led, but done at the level of a legal order. For example, there's one Tsimshian legal order, but 7 Tsimshian communities. Scale is critical to both law and governance. Number 2, Indigenous human rights. The best of spirituality and law must include rebuilding Indigenous human rights as part of the responsibility of Indigenous self-government. This includes defining discrimination, articulating who a rights bearer is, and who has legal obligations regarding human rights within specific legal traditions. Scholar Sally Engel-Mary asks, how does one come to understand herself in terms of rights, including human rights? She argues that whether one has a rights consciousness derives from one's experience with the legal system where one learns whether her experiences matter to law. In other words, the adoption of oneself as rights defined depends on encounters with the police, with all of the institutions of law. I argue that whether a person understands themselves as human rights bearing in Indigenous societies also depends on that person's experience with Indigenous law. So think of Veera, Pamela, Elsie, and Eva, all real women. We need to ask, how are abused women and girls encouraged and supported by Indigenous law? What are Indigenous definitions of sexual assault and rape? Why don't we know this? What are the historic and present-day legal processes and institutions that deal with gender and sexuality issues? To answer these questions means pushing far beyond the prevailing and often spiritually characterized rhetoric about Indigenous women and about law. Dignity and agency are what makes law legal, and as such, they are a necessary legality in Indigenous legal traditions. Indigenous law, as with any law, are intellectual processes for managing ourselves as societies. Law by declaration, spiritually or otherwise, is only about following rules and about behavior, not thinking and reasoning. Arguably, when law loses its legalities, it's reduced to power and ceases to be law, and we know that all law can fail. So a brief return to the Spirit Respite Village. Hey, Val. Yes, Veera? The interim report on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry calls us sacred. Why is that? I guess we need to ask what work the term sacred does. What is evoked by using the language of the sacred? Oh, quit being such a law professor. I mean, shouldn't we not be killed, whether we're sacred or not? I see. Yes, I think you're right, Veera. Thank you.